I am Monica Yellowtail, working as a support for this conference. If you have any questions, concerns, or tech questions, please reach out to David at redwind.net or via the platforms chat. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redwind is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including but not limited to children and youth, housing and homeless services, elder abuse, responses to urban Native survivors. Very recently was awarded with the Tribal Comprehensive TTA Award. This TTA ranges from policy review via email, one-ones with programs, all the way to site visits. If you're interested, you can contact me at monica@redwind.net. If you are interested, you can also visit our website at redwind.net for additional information on services we provide, upcoming events, resources, handouts, and guidebooks that you can download. This project is supported by grant number 2017 TAAX K023, awarded by the Office on Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed through this publication, program, exhibition are those of authors and do not necessarily reflect on the views of the U.S. Department of Justice. Presenting this session today is Hope, and we also have Miss Raquel. I'm going to read out their bios real quick and kind of give you a little bit of information about them. So Hope Wenke, I hope I said that right, Hope, an enrolled member of Omaha Tribe of Nebraska, has worked with Red Wind's Hasaya Advocate Program, both as an advocate and the program director, where she worked to address violence against Native survivors of domestic and sexual violence through direct services in Colorado Springs, Colorado. As a Hasaya advocate, Hope provided culturally sensitive and appropriate advocacy, including safety planning with victims through hotline calls, face-to-face contact, court medical accompaniment, assisted with identifying and securing resources for Hasaya and survivors. As program director, Hope was engaged in overseeing this urban Native program, working to ensure program compliance, confidentiality for victims, while assisting in project and program planning, along with preparing, submitting grant reporting data. Currently, Hope serves as a project coordinator for Red Wind's responses to urban Natives programs. Here she uses her experience as an advocate to give technical assistance on providing services to Native populations living in urban areas.
With the ha.
And then we also have Miss Raquel DeHerrera speaking with us today.
Hello.
Sorry, one moment.
That would have been my house. So we all understand, we all have kiddos, and I have 3 of them, and grandma.
Sorry, I was having a little problem getting to Raquel's. One moment. So it says Raquel's been with Red Wind for more than 5 years. So as a, how do you say it? Taracula Apache and Mexican descendant, Raquel has been with Red Wind for more than 5 years. Her BA is in sociology, where her topics include of interest included families, gender-based violence, power and privilege, and settler
I think we might be having some internet issues.
I was just going to say, Raquel, do you just want to go ahead? And
it's don't having internet issues, guys.
Yeah, no worries. I know I introduced myself in the introduction for those who weren't able to join. I have been with Red Wind for 7 years, and my BA is in sociology, and did some grad school work, and with that, I did focus on children and families with that. So yes, thank you for joining, and we'll just get started with our presentation. Thank you, Monica, so much.
All right, so I just want to welcome you all for coming to this session, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for the second one after this. I wanted to acknowledge today's topic is not an easy one. We know that when you're training as an advocate, you sometimes get a little overwhelmed with the information that you hear, especially when we're dealing with children and youth. So if you need to take a moment or are feeling uncomfortable, certainly do so. We definitely would like for you to do that and take care of yourself. Next slide, please. I just love this picture because I think of little bitty hands and learning. And the first thing I think of is understanding and learning will keep us motivated, and especially as advocates. And even I see that April is a domestic violence program manager. The work that we do, again, is extremely tough, but also very rewarding. It takes a certain passion, it takes a certain drive. And I just wanted to personally thank you each for really doing the work you do. Raquel, do you have anything else you wanted to mention?
I think the one thing that came to mind that you had mentioned in April as a program director, I think, I really appreciate you being here and really learning and listening and offering us, maybe what your program experiences or the needs that you might have, but really, how do we as advocates and as programs who domestic violence, sexual assault programs, how do we make sure that we are including children and youth in our responses and into our programs and the resources? I think I really do thank you for being here. It is just wonderful to see, and I am really happy to see everybody here and happy to do this presentation. Again, this is one of my biggest passions is children and youth. So
we can go to the next slide, and it's exactly what we've been going over. But since we have such a small group, I was hoping you guys would be really engaged. We could open the session up for some actual talking, some face-to-face, even doing some chat. We do have a few idea boards to throw up just to keep the engagement going. We want to make sure that you're getting something from this PowerPoint, and just like our healing journey, we're going to receive something from you as well. So again, understanding why will keep us motivated. It can be grounding and rewarding. Remember to take care of you, and this work will help you take care of your children, our relatives in a good way. Next slide.
all right, so we're going to just start out with what is domestic violence and understanding really what domestic violence is. And I think the next slide has the definition on here, or as it's defined. Domestic violence is physical, mental, or emotional abuse directed at one's spouse, domestic partner, or children. And so I'm going to go with, I also have some information through the NCADV, which is the, God, I can't even think of their acronym, but so it is really, a pattern of physical, mental, or emotional abuse directed at one spouse, domestic partner, or children. It really can include physical violence, sexual violence, psychological violence, and emotional abuse. So there's a lot of components in there, and spiritual abuse. And then I think the severity of it and also the frequency can vary. A lot of things are, each person's can experience domestic violence in a different way, but it really is that pattern of violence. And next slide, please. We will use the power and control wheel. Oh, I guess that's the next slide. But domestic violence, so here we go, is a pattern of abusive behaviors to gain power and control over another person. So we really, we're going to use that power and control wheel in the session to really talk about, some of those tactics. So tactics that are used to maintain and to exert power and control over your partner. And then we're going to kind of talk about in this session how this impacts children and youth who are exposed to violence, whether that's physical violence or seeing one of their parents experience violence. So we're really going to talk about that. And then I think that at the end, we're really going to talk about some of those protective factors or what we can do as advocates to really counteract that impact and to help build resiliency and to really advocate for children and youth who are exposed to violence. And it can be experienced, so it's really important, domestic violence can be experienced by any member of the household, so it's not just an intimate partner. When we think about intimate partner violence, it's really directed at a partner, but also, and we'll kind of talk about this with the power and control wheel, but children can often also be experience violence in a household where there's domestic violence. I also think it's important that we note that children and youth who live, who are in households where there's domestic violence, there's a higher risk of them being physically harmed in their house. I also think it's important to start this off to really emphasize the importance of, as us as advocates doing this work, to really emphasize the importance of strengthening and nurturing the relationship between the non-offending parent and the children. I think something that I've experienced doing this work, and sometimes it's hard, we want to make sure we're protecting children and we want them to be safe and in their homes. And unfortunately, sometimes, and I think it goes with the failure to protect women or victims of violence are often seen as not protecting their children. And we'll get into a little bit more as we get in the power and control wheel. But really, I think it's important. One thing I want to emphasize is that it's really important to strengthen and nurture that relationship between the non-offending parent and children. That is important. And also definitely the importance is making sure children are safe in their homes and in their environment. So just starting with that, we'll move into the power and control wheel. And Hope.
Yes, I'm sending the link right now. I'm going to be periodically putting some resources in for you guys to be able to take. So this wheel was developed in Duluth in the 1980s by advocates and women that were battered. They were having conversations as to why is this happening to us? How is this happening? And they came up with this wheel. On the outside, you'll see that there's, and I'm sure you guys have seen this 1,000 times, but on the outside, you see that there's physical and sexual violence. In the inner is the 8 power and control tactics used to maintain the power. And that power and control is right in the center of the circle. And that is exactly what the abuser is ending up with. Most abusers won't say it, but they want the control. They use these tactics. For example, one example that I'm going to use, and we're going to go into an idea board after this, but most abusers will say, I want, and this is a simple, small one, I want you to put the kids to bed. I want you to discipline them the correct way. Because he wants to try to get the victim or the woman to execute the parenting as he wants it parented. And how he uses these tactics to achieve that. Can we pull up the idea boards, please? So in this idea board, it's anonymous. There's only a few of us here, but you can go ahead and I believe you press this plus sign.
So they'll share it in the chat. So they'll put a link for idea boards. So what idea boards is it's kind of like a sticky note. So it's like a board and we have little sticky notes. And this time we only have one section. Yep. And this is exactly what it looks like. So if you go in the chat, there will be a link and it will bring you to this page. And so we're asking the question of how have you seen the using children tactic in your area of work? And you'll hit the add button on there and you can type and it will show up as like a little post-it note, and it's anonymous. We won't see who's doing it. Yeah, I don't know in the chat, did that get added in there? Yes, so it's in the chat. You can click on that and write some things in there. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to.
Oh, no, you're okay. I was like, I think there's a little green plus sign.
And it will take a couple minutes to kind of update. I think I just wanted to talk a little bit more about power and control and using children. So we all, I think, as Hope said, in a lot of work that we do, power and control wheel guides our work, guides what we do. And this section will really be focusing on that tactic, using children. And we'll see how they all kind of intersect, I think, also with the other tactics. Here's some great ones: interfering with parenting, manipulating services, the children being used as a tool. Absolutely. You will lose your children if you don't stay with me. I've seen that before as well.
I've even seen, interfering with parenting where even though the parents are split, they've still had the history of abuse. And so they take turns with the children and he still will use, he'll do everything opposite. Like they have to nap at this time. They not supposed to have sugar at this time. And he'll bring them back with wet diaper and no clothes and haven't napped. And out of just spite for her and not putting the children first. And I've seen 1,000 times, you'll lose your children if you don't stay with me. That is my story. My kids' father was extremely abusive and I was with him for 7 years. It took me 7 years to finally get out. He would use every tactic possible. And that was his main one. I'm going to turn you into CPS. My mom, like they have tribal, it's I guess the tribal hierarchy. This was on the reservation and, we have people in council and you'll lose your children if you don't do this. And somewhere I thought, I know the physical abuse is there. And that tactic scared the living daylights out of me. And that's all he had to say. And I gave in.
I think those are some great points that you bring up, Hope. It's kind of that sabotaging parenting, just using children because they know it gets to the non-offending parent.
These are all really great. Well, they're not great, but would anybody be willing to unmute and share a story with us? Of course, keeping confidentiality. I've also seen a lot of the talk bad about the other parent. So the child is having to choose sides, which is already causing a lot of trauma for that child. I imagine a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression. And we'll save these idea boards as a PDF, and we can get them sent out to you guys after the presentation. Did anybody have any other ones? Economic abuse is huge. I as well, I actually wasn't able to work during my time of my 7-year span. And I couldn't even buy groceries. I basically just stayed home isolated. I actually had lost like my other side, my urban side family due to my choice. I actually made the choice to choose him because I would lose my kids rather than reach out for support. And I mean, it's really traumatizing. And I think my kids were so young that I want to say they don't remember, but I think it more comes out in my parenting. And we kind of talked about that earlier as we continue to heal. And using children is just one tactic. You know, this is 1 out of the 8, and multiple times they're using numerous tactics at one time.
Yeah, they intersect, right? That coercion, those threats of if you leave, they're gonna take the children away and give them to me. You know, there's those threats. And then that economic. So a lot of the time, even though there's, you know, these tactics and we kind of divide them up, they can intersect with one another. Absolutely.
One of the tactics that I've heard before is if the abuser didn't help clean the home and he didn't work, he wouldn't help take care of the children, yet he would say, this house is a mess. This house is so messy that, you know, I'm gonna, if you try to take me to court, I have evidence and I'm gonna use this evidence because you don't know how to keep this house clean, and I will get the kids. And I mean, it was just a constant threat and trying to say, you know, manipulation about using videos, and yet he wouldn't clean the home himself. So that was and it was a convincing tactic.
I think that too, thank you for sharing, April. That ties right in directly to like male privilege. And that being a whole tactic, because I remember a story Vicki telling. She talks about this man would just sit in a chair and he would demand, like, you have to bring me the remote. Like, he would just sit there all day and verbally abuse her, and then could physically abuse her and sexually abuse her as well. But he would sit in his recliner and not do anything. And that's what that man sounds like to me. And every day she would have to bring him the remote. Like, that was his thing. I'm the king, that's my crown. So that's very, very common, unfortunately.
And Hope, you hit that right on, male privilege. And unfortunately, society has this idea that it's a woman's responsibility for a clean home, you know, where we could argue, like, you took all these videos of a house that you lived in and it wasn't clean. So it's also, that should be, if we want to just entertain your threat, that should go against you as well, because you're a parent, you're an adult in that house, you're able to clean too. And so it is using that male privilege of, you know, it's your responsibility, it's your job. And I'm going to use these social expectations of women and use it against you. And it is a strong tactic. That's a very strong, April. I can imagine that. Yes, that is a very effective tactic to use to maintain and exert power and control. And it's so insidious and it's harmful. And I've seen that also.
One of the situations I kind of saw was a grandma and alleged baby dad, or however you say it, alleged father, kidnap a child and that person, that father, alleged father, was not on the birth certificate. And because tribal cop and police knew that person but did not know the mother, they sided with the alleged father, and they let that alleged father take that child from that mother. And I could not believe, someone would allow that. How would you? That's basically kidnapping of that child, and they allowed that child to be taken by that person. And that mother, was, in a situation she'd not been in. She'd only been living there for a week, and her situation was like to the point where she was very emotional, had almost traumatic PTSD. She's hyperventilating. She's having separation anxiety, and no one would listen to her. And they justified it because they called her crazy. And I could not believe they allowed that situation. They said, "Oh, if you don't stop, we're going to send you to a mental health facility," because they allowed someone to take that child. And it was a real situation. I could not believe they allowed something like that to happen and occur. And to this day, I tell everyone, if you are not going to marry that person, do not have them sign the birth certificate, because you maintain full custody of your child, physical and stuff. I don't know how true that is, but I do also say that for myself. I'm just like, don't let someone else tell you that they can take your child. You have custody of that child. And so that's some of that situation where they're using that child, threatening her, not only with her saying she's mentally unstable, but also allowing that child to be taken from her. Those are those two things I've seen.
Thank you, Valerie, for bringing that up, because those were two of the tactics that we hadn't really dove into, using emotional abuse. And that was him telling her that she's crazy, putting her down. I'm sure she felt guilty, or he was making her feel guilty, and then minimizing, denying, and blaming. And
also using tribal law enforcement as buddies.
People weren't taking it serious.
That's where it's so critical that we make sure our tribal law enforcement, just law enforcement period, are trained to understand, predominant aggressors and abuser, who's abusive. We see this happen all the time when, especially in states where there's dual arrests for domestic violence, but often we know as advocates, abusers, when police show up at the door, they're really good at being calm, collected, and the victim is often, really honestly just distraught. I mean, and the abuser is always like, "See, she's crazy. She has gone crazy. She is insane," and it plays off of that stigma of women and hysterical, that idea. And then also it's that tactic, and that's exactly how, that happens. And as parents, as moms, or anyone experiencing that, we know that could really, there's always that threat in the back of their mind. So even if we can logically look at what happened was illegal, and that, yes, he could be charged with kidnapping because he's not on that birth certificate, still there's always that threat, that because we see it in media, we see how victims are portrayed, we see how victims are blamed often. So there's always that threat of, there's probably some truth in what these abusers are saying, so I better get in check. I better, not, and even though what happened was really that was not very legal at all. So I think with,
I did want to say,
oh,
Raquel, is also that law enforcement will not touch family issues without a court order. So police and law enforcement won't touch it, because it's a family issue and not a criminal issue. So that's another thing, where law enforcement doesn't have the ability to do anything without court order. However, it didn't make sense that they couldn't do anything, even though the mother was holding the birth certificate, showing the law enforcement and tribal cop that he wasn't on the birth certificate. And I'm just so confused by that aspect. Is make sure you advocate and don't leave that child there. whatever you do to find out how to get secure situation on a court order. Never leave that child unattended, because that's how they'll get you.
And I think that's what's important. I think in the work that we're doing to go circle back as advocates in children and youth, we really want to make sure that we're aware of just laws surrounding children in custody, children, and so that we can help provide resources and provide information to those we're working with. Because honestly, you know, and I'm going back, you know, where I was an advocate in Colorado, but you could definitely, you know, you could challenge law enforcement and that person who still kidnapped your kid, like that. There would be legal grounds for that. I think a great resource is womenslaw.org. I can't remember. I'll put it in the chat. I'll find it, but they break it down by state. And I know it gets very tricky. Also, we're adding another component of tribal jurisdiction and those laws. And, you know, as Hope mentioned, you know, it's kind of that hierarchy where, you know, men might have more of, you know, in your tribal community. So that might be different, but I think that's a really good start, is to really know some of those laws surrounding custody, knowing your tribe, you know, your Law and Order Act, tribal law, what that looks like. What does your tribe, you know, custody law look like, or what does, what does that look like?
I think the ICWA law too, especially being in an urban area, that's a lot of urban Native women with their children are not usually with Native men. And that's one of the main threats, is your children will get taken. And then what? Like a lot of places don't have Native ICWA or foster parents, and we'll go all into ICWA. I believe it's next week. But that's another huge tactic that they use. We can go to the next slide.
So the next slide is really just kind of emphasizing what we've all said. So interfering with caretaking. So when I first learned about children exposed to violence, an example that was given that really stood out to me was an abusive partner would not allow the mom to breastfeed her child, would interfere with that caretaking, wouldn't let her parent her children or do the things that comes with caretaking. So interfering with that. We also know women who are pregnant, often the risk of physical violence and even death is just expounded. So I don't even know if that's a word, but incredibly, there's a big risk when women are pregnant. So interfering with caretaking, and then interfering even with, you know, would not allow them to take prenatal vitamins, or wouldn't allow her to access healthcare while being pregnant. So this starts, it doesn't even, you know, when we think about children and youth exposed to violence, it really doesn't always start when children are born. It, you know, they can be impacted through when in the womb, when they are, you know, in their mom's belly. So there's that, interfering with that caretaking, challenging the authority of the non-offending parent. So, you know, if the mom says, no, where you're not allowed to do this, and the abusive parent says, oh, yes, they can go, they can do it, you know, and kind of challenging and authority is such a weird word to use with children and youth, because I don't think it's, you know, authority, but it's really challenging the credibility and challenging, you know, that mom's or that parent's decision around parenting. So, you know, and then, you know, that not only challenges that, but it also kind of creates a resentment towards the child and the non-offending parent. Like, this person lets me do it and you're not letting me do it, you know, so it kind of impacts that relationship. Using children to relay abusive messages to the non-offending parent. So, you know, tell your mom this dinner sucks. tell your mom that she needs to do this, or this house is a mess, that she needs to clean this house, so in that instance, threatening to take children away. So there's many components. So we kind of talked about taking children away if you leave. Hope kind of mentioned, the racial component. So non-native, let's just say a non-native man, not only using male privilege, but using white privilege, to threaten taking children away or having children taken away from them. Using visitations to assert power and control over non-offending parents. So, visitations, I think, is one of those that can be really scary for non-offending parents. So definitely abusers using that to exert power and control over them. And these are just, there are numerous ways that we see this play out. But these are some big ones that I think we see often. Next slide. So we'll start into some statistics. So American Indian and Alaska Native women residing on Indian reservations suffer domestic violence and physical assault at rates far exceeding women of other ethnicities and locations. And I don't know if this is in there, but there's an NIJ study, I think it might be an NIJ study, I can put that in the chat as well, that kind of breaks this down even more. But there's a national annual incidence rates and lifetime prevalence rates for physical assault. They're also higher for American Indian, Alaska Native women compared to other ethnic groups. In a 2008 CDC study, 39% of Native women surveyed identified as victims of intimate partner violence. And according to the Bureau of Justice of Statistics, U.S. Department of Justice, the Office of Justice Programs, at least 70% of violent victimizations experienced by American Indians are committed by persons not of the same race. And this is at a higher rate. So often we see in this work statistically, so white women are abused by white men. Same could be for other ethnicities, and here for Indigenous statistics, we see that often that the perpetrators are non-native, at least 70%. And that goes with a lot of dynamics that are at play, and that could be jurisdiction, that can be a lot of things, that racism, oppression, those type of things. Next slide, please.
Well, and I just wanted to add, I'm sure most of us know that more than 4 out of 5 women, Native, Indian, or Alaska Native, have been victim of violence in their lifetime. And when we think about that, and even 56.1 has experienced sexual assault in their lifetime. So when you think of those numbers, 84% of mothers, could we say, and the children are experiencing this, even if, like I always say, even if they're not directly seeing it, somehow in the household, it's impacting children and youth.
Absolutely. And yeah, we do need to think about, a lot of the time women are, and I know, especially when I was an advocate, I would say the majority of women who walked in our door were moms. Next slide, please. So there's some more statistics. So thinking about during a physical assault, American Indian, Alaska Native women were more likely to be injured than women of all other groups, and more severe injuries are happening. This is very true even with guns, that there are weapons. They experience more severe injuries and the use of violent weapons. Violence against Indian women occurs as a gauntlet in the lives of Indian women. So at one end, verbal abuse, and at the other, murder. So most Indian women do not report. Federal government studies have consistently shown that American Indian women experience much higher levels of sexual violence than other women in the US data gathered. by the U.S. Department of Justice, and that indicates that Native American Alaska Native women are more than 2.5 times more likely to be raped or sexually assaulted. And additionally, 34% or more than 1 in 3 Native women will be raped during their lifetime. And that's a 50% higher rate than the next most victimized demographic of women. And we can really, talk about dynamics at play and conditions that really, like this doesn't happen. This doesn't just happen, that there are things that really contribute. I think one of the biggest statistics that I think is important to know, especially when we're talking about children and youth, and this came from, and I know it's 10 years old, but in 2012, Barack Obama's administration, they did a study, they had a task force for American Indian Alaska Native children exposed to violence. And what they had found, what they stated, was that American Indian Alaska Native children suffer exposure to violence at higher rates than any other racial group in the United States. They also experience post-traumatic stress disorder 3 times the rate of the general population, the same as soldiers coming back from Afghanistan. So it's critical that we kind of look at it as this is a package. And I think, when we think about children and youth, often they're caretakers. And, I think their primary caretakers are moms, or, and we often can see in our Indigenous communities, grandparents. But it's really important to talk about the level of violence women are experiencing in our communities. And then as Hope brought that about, we really need to connect the dots of children being exposed to violence. So Native women are incredibly more likely and experience violence at higher rates than a lot of demographics. And also children, American Indian, Alaska Native children suffer exposure to domestic violence at higher rates than any other racial group. And of course, this was in 2012, and I think there's more, hopefully there's more information. But I had one more quick thing to say. We can see with these high numbers, it's almost a continued genocide on Native women. And so kind of where do we go from here? When we come back from our break, I know we went 2 minutes over. We're going to talk about, dive into what does this mean for our children. Yeah, so we'll just leave it at our statistics and go take a break, 30 minutes, take care of yourself. I know these statistics are really a hard thing to leave on because they're really heavy, but really we're going to come back and really talk about some protective factors and the strength of our community. So 30 minutes, we'll meet here at 3 or 2 Mountain Standard Time. Valerie, if you want to go to the slide, go back a slide.
Oh, we changed it, so it should be.
Oh, you did change it. Okay, so next slide, please.
I do. Before moving on, I read something on, it's very well kind, and it's on the impacts, and it talks about that abusive or children seeing abuse doesn't have to be a cycle of behavior. They could see it once, but regardless, violence can lead to victim blaming, and abuse can be unpredictable, no matter what. So I don't know where I'm trying to go with this, but feeling that pain when witnessing domestic violence as a child is not always necessarily going to lead to all these symptoms. It can lead to an adult growing up on a healthy, normal path as well. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
I think that's a great thing to throw out, Hope, because I think these things are, I think absolutely we can see, and there's studies, where 2 siblings, and I think Rebecca spoke to this in her experience and her brother's experience, but 2 siblings can grow up in the same home and completely, completely be on different trajectories. And I think one of the things that you're talking about, Hope, is really, it could be, the mental, emotional, there might be someone who's really healthy mentally, emotionally. But with the ACE studies, a lot of what this study, because I think children, whether they grow up in a home where they're exposed to violence or not, there's a lot of trauma in the world. And so what the ACEs really talk about is chronic diseases and a shortness of life expectancy because of these traumas. And I think that's really, and I think it's important to bring out hope. And we'll talk about protective factors and how we, really help mitigate these impacts, right? Like, children who are exposed to violence, if they have A, B, C, D in their life, they could very much not experience some of these things. It's just what we see a lot of the time when, these are some impacts of that violence. So again, what does it mean for our children? So children who are exposed to violence in the home are 15% more likely to be physically or sexually assaulted than the national average. So, they're more likely to be, and there's a lot of data on, maybe why that is, or questioning what is it that makes them more susceptible to being or vulnerable to being assaulted. And it goes down to just seeing what's modeled for them and kind of how they see relationships. And they kind of, as kids, we process information. So one of the biggest things that we as kids learn is through social modeling, role modeling. So, they're seeing the way mom and dad, or mom and mom, or dad, or their parents are interacting, and they kind of get stored into their brain as this is what a relationship is. And so then, and really good abusers are really good at, targeting vulnerable people. So, there's a lot of things that kind of come in with that statistic, but just knowing that this is, something that we need to be aware of as advocates and in our programs, so that we can, okay, if this is happening, how do we, educate children and youth who have seen this, and how do we show them that this is not what healthy relationships look like? This is not, a normal thing, that, that is not how we express love, and things like that. Next slide, please. Girls are more likely to be victims as adults if they are raised in a home with domestic violence. So again, it's kind of just learning some of this behavior, and also other things. I think when kids are exposed to violence, and there's a lot of instability, and that can lead to it, but that's, they're more likely to. And then there's also the risk of those who are exposed to violence will grow up to be violent in their relationships. So there's that risk as well.
I think we did miss that slide too. The boys who witness domestic violence are twice as likely to abuse their partners, and children when they become adults. And you just touch base on that. That always reminds me of something Vicki always talks about, is how it takes a village to raise an abuser. As a community, even on a reservation, we need to have the appropriate resources and the education, making sure that there's programs for these children to prosper, and really grow.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Next slide, please. So, and then we're kind of going to go into children who have experienced domestic violence in their lives are more likely to have difficulties in school. And so this, we go with those impacts, right? They might have negative self-talk, bullied behavior, regression. So regressing back to things that they haven't done in a long time, like thumb sucking, or, not being able to pay attention, kind of the all these things. So they might have more difficulty in school. They might isolate themselves and be really, and I think what's really important is not just as adults, and when we talk about victims and survivors, there's not one way to experience trauma. There's not one way to be. So children, will kind of experience and do things differently, but there are studies that show they're more likely to have difficulties in school. I know when my life's in disarray, it's like hard to show up in the world. So same for kids. Next slide, please.
So the ACEs test, which is the Adverse Childhood Experience quiz that you can find, I did put the link in the chat box. But this is, the ACE score is a tally of different types of abuse, neglect, and other hallmarks of a rough childhood. And according to the Adverse Childhood Experience study, the rougher your childhood is, the higher your score is likely to be. And that higher score puts you at a higher risk for later having those health problems. And so I was going to go over the questions on the ACE questionnaire really quick. One is, did you feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect or take care of you? And these should all be done prior to your 18th birthday. Did you lose a parent through divorce, abandonment, death, or other reason? Did you live with anyone who was depressed, mentally ill, or attempted suicide? Did you live with anyone who had a problem with drinking or using drugs, including prescription drugs? Did your parents or adults in your home ever hit, punch, beat, or threaten to harm each other? Did you live with anyone who went to jail or prison? Did a parent or an adult in your home ever swear at you, insult you, or put you down? Did a parent or an adult in your home ever hit you, beat you, kick you, or physically hurt you in any way? Did you feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were special? Did you experience unwanted sexual contact? And so those questions are just, I mean, having to ask, ask a child those and think back to your childhood. It's just, it's traumatizing. And when I did this, I was like, holy moly, like how much trauma we're carrying when we're so tiny. But we're going to do this quick idea boards.
Oh, we are. Okay.
It's pull up. So if you can go ahead and type in different types of impacts for behavior and also for physical and mental health. And you can ignore the third line.
I think one important thing to tie in is that, I think often what happens is there's that saying that children are resilient and they always bounce back, and that, exposure to violence is not that serious. And I think the ACEs, what they have shown is that it has a very big impact all through our lives, even as we get older. A lot of chronic things that happen, substance use problems, mental health problems, a lot of things that we kind of label, if you have high blood pressure, or if you suffer from depression, a lot of that we aren't connecting the dots of maybe that's an impact of childhood. And so, your experiences. And so I think the really big important piece with this study is showing that, no, this is a big deal, that it's incredibly important that we invest in our communities, invest in our families, invest into our programs that support the health of families and children, and are really, working to end violence, because that impact is incredibly huge. And I mean, it shows that life expectancy, and we see this in our Native communities. We have a very, when we look at from demographics, our mortality rate is much younger than a lot of other demographics. Sometimes it's some communities, it's 40s, that's a very hard thing. And when we look at, all of the things that our communities have faced, it really comes full circle to show that this, is legitimate. And I think, when we talk about those impacts, it's really good to use this resource, this study, this data. I think you can go on the Kaiser Permanente. They have, all the resources, and even the CDC has it. When you're really advocating in your program, look, we want to make sure we're responding to our children and youth who are exposed to violence, and you have this data to really back up how important it is, and why you need that funding for that.
I think too, and as tough as those questions are, this tool is just used for guidance, and prevention. But they also don't ever talk about NACEs, like the positive factors, and I liked how you kind of bring up like the resilience and how do we protect children. We have grandparents who love us, or people who support and understand and believe us. And that's the big part as an advocate, being able to go from that hard, tough conversation to like, there are people who support you. There's people here who care. And let's pull some of those positives, from your early trauma. And I can't even read those because my screen's too small.
Yeah, so I see under behavior, we have anxiety, depression, PTSD, the fawn response. I don't know if whoever put that in there, do you want to explain what that is? You definitely don't have to. So that's under behavior, and they have physical and mental. So substance abuse as an adult, unhealthy relationship with food, rash, sores, headaches, ulcers, many physical issues that can connect to ACEs. So when I think about it, is just our body survives in very high stress, traumatic situations. And so we develop these things that we use to cope. So some people talked about using alcohol to cope or food to cope. And, and I kind of shy away from saying that, the food thing, but I do think that, there are ways that we use things to cope, and whether they're healthy, unhealthy or not. So just to go there. And then fawn response refers to consistently abandoning your own needs to serve others to avoid conflict, criticism, or disapproval. Fawning is also called the please and appease response. Okay, I've heard it named something else too. Gosh, I can't even remember. It's a psychological term where it's like the people please, but it's much bigger than that. So learned empathy, codependent. And I'm trying to think, I'll think of it and put it in there. But yes, thank you for explaining that, that that's what that is. And I think that's very true, especially it's a way to cope and a way to protect yourself. And so I think kids, one thing that I have learned in the 10 plus years that I've worked with children is kids are resourceful in that they will find things to help them cope with their, often children, especially younger children, don't have the words or the ability to explain what they're feeling or how they're interpreting things. So, they find certain things to cope. And a good example is I was working with someone, and she was really concerned because her daughter would literally be distraught if they didn't let her watch this movie over and over and over again. And this was after, being exposed to violence, and, they were concerned, but it's like, that was her way. That was her safety. Like that was literally, that movie was how she coped with that trauma. And it was literally like what was keeping her, surviving. It was her survival. So, when I think about that, it's really important to know those coping mechanisms and to know just those impacts. And then as advocates and as program, the program directors, it's really important to know these things so that when we're talking to a victim or survivor who come in and their parents, and they're talking about these experiences, we can provide information for them. We can say, oh, here are some of these impacts. And then we're going to talk about this as we move forward. But here are the things that you can do because honestly, and I think as a parent too, and I'm, just as a parent, you're so worried about getting it wrong. Like you look at this and you're like, I am so worried that I'm going to mess up my child. And so I think victims and survivors, when they see this, the impact, it can really bring a lot of feelings for them. And so as much as it's important to understand these are some of the impacts, it's so important to know, how do you move from that to this, and to provide that to parents who you're working with.
I like that you brought up that example, because I think of like with the internet now, a lot of kids that is their safe place. They don't have to deal with what's going on at home. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And I think even with the effects of domestic violence right now that we're seeing on children and the impacts, we can see their reactions. It can be from like a short time. We can see them immediately, and it wouldn't come out for a long time as well. I didn't mean to say it like that, but
no, it makes total sense. I think we do that as adults,
yeah.
Where you have a reaction and you're like, if you really dig in, why do I have that reaction? It's like, oh,
right.
That's where it's coming from.
So I think with that, we can go to the next slide. So the impacts of trauma or childhood trauma look like for ages 0 to 2, they demonstrate poor verbal skills, they exhibit memory problems, they scream or cry excessively, and have a poor appetite, low weight, or digestive problems. And so just like I said, things can happen down the road. I even think of one child who held his bowels, like he would not use the restroom. And that was just an impact from the trauma that he experienced as an infant.
Yeah, I think it's really important to note, especially because, as advocates, we're not early childhood, we're not those experts in that. And I think, these are, some impacts of trauma, and we really often focus on this, but it also could be a lot of other things. So it's really just understanding, like, if someone has poor verbal skills and they've experienced violence, but maybe it's because of other reasons, or sometimes, there could, that it might not be only because of trauma. I think sometimes we kind of think, oh, this kid is misbehaving, something must be happening that's bad, and I think that's it's going to be really important to make sure we have a good relationship with who we're working with. And I just think it's really important to kind of know what age appropriate development looks like. And yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there, that little caveat.
You can go to the next slide.
So children 3 years and older, this is where we can see, having difficulties focusing or learning in school, acting younger than they are, so regressing. If you, have a child who never had issues using the bathroom, and all of a sudden they do, that could be there could be trauma that has happened. Develop learning disabilities, show poor skill development, act out in social situations, imitate the abusive traumatic event, maybe verbally abusive, maybe unable to trust others or make friends, believe that they're to blame for the traumatic event, lack self-confidence, have trouble sleeping, experience stomach aches or headaches. So again, these are those impacts, those mental impacts, social, emotional impacts, physical impacts. Especially if, all of a sudden this behavior wasn't normal and then it's all of a sudden happening. You might want to look deeper in, but these are just some more impacts that we see more, as age appropriate for kids, school age children, as opposed to those younger kiddos.
One of the ones that I saw all the time was the school, I would say, like around a school age child, they were taking the blame for that abuse. they were putting it all on themselves, which was causing a lot of anxiety. And then also a lot of nightmares with like PTSD or a change in sleep patterns as well. And, you know, when I was looking up this stuff earlier this week, and my son is autistic. And I'm like, these traits are so similar to autism. And I'm like, what? I'm going to do a study, but there has to be one out there to see. I mean, what if my trauma, and, you know, it has something to do with autism. And so I just want to share that because I see such like identical some of the impacts. And next slide, please. Oh, you can go to the next one. We already did that one.
And I just see Cecilia Fire Thunder had a comment in the chat. For many folks, they might not know what trauma means, with many folks not finishing school and need clearer definition so they understand. And what is trauma, and how can caregivers understand actions that can cause trauma? A clear definition even for adults. And I think that's very true, especially right now. I kind of see a lot of the word trauma that gets thrown around a lot. And really how I define it, and I don't know, Hope, if how you might define it, but really I think of it as just a really an event that really is disturbing or just really hard to process. Like your brain gets into survival. It's a survival thing, and what can be traumatic for one person might not be traumatic for another person. You know, that might be, it can look very different. And really it's, you know, physical trauma, even, you know, when we think about, there's like different components. So an accident, and you have physical trauma to your body, and things like that. Hope, I don't know if you want to add.
It just made me think of, I think it's Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart. She has a really, really good, I'm going to find it and I'll put it in the link, but how historical trauma or intergenerational trauma and unresolved grief, how we can really evaluate it, educate ourselves, and that's how we make a change in our community. And ever since I've read that, I mean, it was like life-changing to me. Because I think, you know, like it really took me a long time. It actually took me a crisis to realize I had childhood trauma. So I already had all this trauma I was carrying. I was in survival fight mode for so long. And then it took a crisis to really activate, wow, you know? And so I do think that, as being Indigenous, it's already in our epigenetics. You know, we're already carrying all that trauma. And then as a child, having to deal with another immediate crisis is just adding more trauma. And, you know, I think I'll share that with you. I'll find it and I'll put it in the link because I want you guys to all read it. It's really interesting. And that's kind of how I looked at my trauma after I read that.
And I think all the work that she does is wonderful. And I think, you know, as programs, I think it is important to kind of think about, how are you all talking about trauma? What are you defining it as? So when you're working with someone, you know, they have that definition, that clear definition, you know, and I think it really does depend. So if you go to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, they have trauma types, and they kind of label it as bullying as a trauma, community violence, complex trauma, disasters, early childhood trauma, intimate partner violence, medical trauma, physical abuse, refugee trauma, sexual abuse, sex trafficking, terrorism and violence, traumatic grief. You know, I guess this, you know, that intergenerational historical trauma could go under, you know, community violence. So there's those types, but then you look at others and how they define like chronic trauma, complex trauma. Like it's a big, like trauma is I mean, I think Cecilia, you bring up, you know, trauma is this thing that we kind of throw around, but there's, I mean, people who study it for years and years and years, and it's a very big thing. And there's a lot of of things that go around it. And I think, for us and how I use it is really, it's just something that's really hard for us to process. And it's a distressing situation. And something that's just really hard to, our brain kind of puts us in that fight, flee, fight, freeze moment. And our brain kind of, stores it for protection. And so, when we feel threatened, we kind of go back to where we were at that traumatic moment. I mean, it's a lot. So yeah. And then Marcy put in, I know a 9-year-old that has a lot of stomach issues, but I believe it has to do with watching his mother struggle with her mental health issues. What are your thoughts?
We're no experts in this for sure, but from experiences, I would think, like the more you hold it, the more it's going to hurt, but it causes pain. And so they're trying it's kind of a rational response, and it doesn't seem like a behavioral issue. It seems more rooted into like something psychological. That's my personal opinion, but I'm no expert.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not a trauma expert. I think, the APA, the American Psychological Association, they define it as trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, natural disaster. Immediate after the event, shock and denial are typical. Long-term reactions include unpredictable emotions, strained relationships, flashbacks, physical symptoms like headaches, nausea. These feelings are normal, but it really impacts a lot of these things. So I think, yeah. And I think to go to that, children really are their caregivers are who they rely on to, for everything. And so if you see, like I said, I think kids process things. They don't really have the words or, the experiences to kind of work through what they're seeing. So of course, I think, yeah, absolutely. If they, it might be very stressful and really hard. And also, I don't know that person, but I can imagine, seeing their mom kind of struggle through some of those things. It could really, be stressful to them and anxious for them, and they can kind of become anxious around that. I know I've experienced that, and that's kind of that intergenerational, response.
And then we can really skip this one, unless I guess we can ask everyone if you want to put in a response. What are some ways we can support our children who have witnessed domestic violence or have experienced any of the ACEs? For me, one is, I think, to make those children a priority, and make that safety a priority for those children. And you can go back to the slide. We don't need to do the idea boards.
Yeah, and I did see in the chat that you have, April says they currently have a shelter and a house with a family and children. They notice children are acting out. And I think one thing also just to understand is even children and change. So, I think about a good example is my kiddo who we moved across the country. Well, not really across the country, but we moved to a new state, and a week before COVID happened, and it kind of uprooted everything. So of course there were, there are things that, just some behavioral differences. And I think it's just dysregulation often with, situations that they don't really know how to process, like I think we do it as adults too, you know, like you might snap a little more, or if you're under this, just to realize that those kiddos are, you know, have uprooted, you know, they're going through a change, that they are experiencing something that's different. You know, there's probably less structure, or maybe there is more structure, maybe there's more structure. And so it really, kiddos who are going through some of this will need a little, like Hope said, you just need to really focus on that, you know. And so I think if you see that kiddos are, you know, they might be having some, you know, acting out. And I think one of the things that I approach, and I think Cecilia put that in there, what happened to you? So we always ask, like, what is wrong with you? And if we reframed it to what happened to you, we kind of reframe that differently. And if we think about, and there was a good quote that I saw, and it was like, there's no such thing as bad kids or bad behavior. It's really kids just being dysregulated, and they need guidance to kind of walk them through this. And so finding ways that you can help guide them through what is going on is going to be really important. And also it's going to be really important to the person who's in the shelter, the parent, you know, how can we help you through this, and help you, you know, what resources do you need as a parent? I think could go really a long way.
I think one of the hardest parts is when the parent themselves are, you know, they're dealing with the stresses of having to take care of their children through this. So reaching the parent and letting him know that, you know, these children need help. But when he's not able to reach out for help for himself, it becomes a little bit more difficult. And I guess the hardest part is wondering, when do we intervene as a program to say your child needs help, and, you know, without trying to involve the system, like, you know, child protective services, or, you know, because it's like we can't really force him to get help for his child. So it feels very sticky.
I I think it's just it's almost similar to us saying, why aren't you leaving him? You know, it's one of those things that it's going to take her time, or the parent time, to we can always make suggestions or offer referrals and resources, but in no way, like you said, do we want to force that upon them or make them even feel that, because they might not come back for support again.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also, as a program, finding ways that you can help strengthen their, you know, relationships. So, you know, having spaces where they can be together and kind of, you know, be together and do some of those resources. And I think, as Hope mentioned, you know, just offer some of those referrals, or even just provide information on it. Even just, you know, coming back with, here, you know, all the resources that Hope kind of shared. How do we, you know, just making it available that they can have, and they can kind of look and see, like, oh, putting the picture together of this is what we see. Will be helpful. And it's really hard, because it is one of those things. And I think we've all, you know, Rebecca touched upon it, that, you know, you don't really want to tell someone how to parent, or, you know, you don't want to create these dynamics. But I think it's really important to kind of just be open and honest about it, and to talk about it in a way that is a safe space to do it. So, and I think Cecilia kind of talked about, so she asked, what are ways to have children express to you how they're feeling when they cannot express the feeling, especially at a younger child, play art therapy, how do we communicate with the ones younger than 5? And I think this is a big piece, where a lot of the time, play art therapy, often through play, kids will kind of express, you know, things in a way that is through play. So they might, you know, have toys and kind of act out kind of what they're experiencing. So I think it would be really important as a program, if you're seeing that some kids are having a hard time in your shelter, maybe think about partnering with, therapists who do specialize in play art therapy, who do specialize in offering resources to children. And I think that's a big one because, when you partner and you have that, I think more people are more likely to use those resources if they're, you're like, hey, we've got this, and it's just kind of a normal thing. So let's say you in your shelter, you bring, it's just, here's what we have every Wednesday. A child therapist will come in and offer play or art therapy. And it's really just talking to kiddos and just getting on their level, and just, because children under 5, they're not going to completely explain how they're feeling. You're going to see it in some of those things, like what we call acting out. And that's just them trying to express that there are needs that they have that they can't fully express. And so we kind of have to figure out, how do we make sure that we're providing that?
Thank you.
I think too, when I'm thinking like more middle-aged kids right now, but we can really teach them. I know with my daughter and me being in this field, and I really teach her boundaries and what a healthy relationship looks like, and like her body autonomy, and this is what safe means, and this is who you can go to, and in this situation. That's how I didn't have that when I was young. Again, it was kind of pushed under the rug. It was normalized. You don't say anything. And if that ever happened to me, like, she'll know, like, that's not right. I know that's not right. So really educating my child, at an age appropriate age.
Yeah, and I think even it's, could be, and not simple, but one thing you could do is make sure you have books that are, there's some really good ones that talk about feelings from a kid's point of view perspective. You're reading it, even 3-year-olds, 2-year-olds who might not, you might not think that helps, but it's like reading those books. So having a story time for kids where you're reading books about feelings and about thought, these things. And I think that would be a good thing to have those resources on hand. Books, having, all these opportunities for kids to express themselves in ways that they do express themselves is important.
I also, it brings me right back to kids using the internet as their safe space. And what I learned with my own child, who has a lot of behavioral issues, problems, and I got him into a therapist, and they told me to get into his space, want to join his safe space, not, you can't play this. And that's it. Almost like when it was time for him to put his Roblox away, it was a total meltdown, traumatic event, because I wasn't understanding that that's where he felt safe. And so our therapist had me sit there with him and engage in this safe space. And so I could understand more. And he's opened up so much more. So I just wanted to share that.
I think that's a good point. I think what's really hard is really, I think meeting even victims and survivors where we're at. I've had a number of women who I've worked with, parents who that was their main focus, was really how, like, I don't really care about resources for me right now. I want to figure out, how do I get resources for my kids? So you'll have that. And then, you might have an experience where, as you have had, April, where it's like, they're not really seeing that. And I think part of it is all you can do is kind of plant the seed to let them know that it's there and available, and that it's important. And just do what you can as a program to provide what you can, because at the end of the day, it really is,
It's the child's own recovery process, just like we all have our own healing journeys. you know, they're gonna do it at their own pace is kind of how I see it.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's not a one size fit all, and it really is, that's where it's really, I think, a big emphasis I would just say out of it all is find those resources who work with children, who are the experts in working with children, find that play therapist, that art therapist, find resources that you can find online and find those things so that you can provide them and that you can, create materials in your shelter that you can hand to parents so that they can look and read, and just provide that. And I see where mom lets her little ones get away with many no good things, as she has not dealt with her guilt of having her babies watch her get beat up. It does create anger from them, mad at both mom and dad. And that's absolutely, I've seen that too, where you make up for things and then there's no boundaries, and then there's no, it kind of does, you're saying like, it just doesn't create a good environment for kids, because kids do need structure, and they do need, as much as we say, they need to know, what is expected of them. And so I think we've seen that before also. And so, I think it's really, what's going to be important is, making sure you have resources for children and youth. And part of that is resources that educate victims and survivors, moms, parents in your program. It educates them, on parenting, and just add that as one of your, things that you offer, because it's just important, Hope, I guess the next slide, you want to jump
Yeah,
in?
we have kind of gone over all this, and these are just a few more examples, but encourage the child to talk about their feelings and validate their emotions, help them understand that they are not at fault, answer their questions honestly, reassure the child that you'll do everything you can to keep them safe, stick to a daily routine as much as possible, and be patient as each child recovers at their own pace.
I think what's important to talk about, and I just want to go this last thought of, when we think about resiliency, it's in having a nurturing adult. So I think, if you at your program can be that nurturing adult during this time, that is going to be important. That is going to be impactful. It's not, a parent is not the only nurturing adult in a child's life. It could be a teacher, it could be an advocate at your shelter. So really thinking about that, and I think we've often put a lot on parents to be the only person to be responsible for this, but we all are, right? Just as Vicki said, it takes in a community to raise an abuser. Well, it takes a community to raise children, to be healthy and not violent. So kind of going and just keep that in mind, that you also have that opportunity to be that nurturing adult in their life.
There's
No, go ahead.
There's actually I have a friend of mine back home on the reservation, and she's had a lot of opportunities to move off the res and huge opportunities for her education. And she's worked at the CPS for, I want to say like almost 4 years. And she has just the heart of gold, the passion. And she says, what are they going to do without me? Because I'm their only consistency right now. And so it just touched my heart, because just having that one adult in their life is making such a huge impact.
So then, creating a safe space. So thinking about how are you making sure that you have a space for kiddos that come in your door? Something that we did with our, Hosea advocate program is we made sure there was a space for kids to just be kids, and providing those books or, things that really help children express themselves in a child way, whether it's playing out, what they're experiencing. I think one way that kids cope is reenacting through play of what they're experiencing, and that's how they process and So we want to make sure we create that space, that it's warm and inviting, but also inviting to children, that it says, oh, children, you're welcome here too. This isn't just an adult space. This is for you. We have things that are for you here. Consider not only physical safety, but that emotional safety. I think for kids, that's big, to feel safe, and really promote that. And then offering water is always a good traditional start. So one of the biggest things that when I was an advocate, like the kids loved coming in because they knew they would be getting fruit snacks, or they knew, and it's something that you think is so simple, but it really was special for them to get. And so really providing that, and just knowing what kids like, young kids, older kids, and then I think even when you have comfort kits, have kits that are for kids. That could be like a stress ball. It could be a fidget spinner. It could be all these things that really help that, those senses that help them kind of, they have something for them.
I wanted just to add a few other examples that Hasia did, but was to even have like an event. Like, yes, we're working with the parents, but it's also important to really focus on those children. We did an Easter egg hunt just this past year, and how well connected those kids, and they become friends, and they're excited to see each other again. They remember each other's names, and so they're going through like similar situations, and so it gives them the opportunity to make friends like that. And then also I was going to say, just have them participate too in any of the women's activities or events that you have, such as like full moon ceremony. Let them come have ceremony with you, or even do a dinner and let them pumpkin carving, or there's just so many different ways that you can include the children. Next slide, please. Establish predictability. Routine, we talked about how it's so important. At home, things are already uncomfortable, they're unpredictable, they're scary. We want to make sure that we're trying to stay in a moment of our own crisis. We want to try to stay as routine as we can. And even me, not not being in a crisis situation right now, it's hard to keep kids in routine. But I know when they are, it makes such a huge difference. I think too, when doing this is a good time. Like when we read books, it's a good time to really talk about our feelings. I did feeling cards. So I bought a pack of feeling cards and like, oh, what was your happy moment today? And we would all share a happy moment. And that just came part of our routine. And so I would then hear some of the things that weren't so great. And it's a time to educate them as well.
I love that example, Hope. That is such a good one. It is. And I think, like I said, kids learn by what they're modeled. So if we have people modeling and saying, I made a mistake, or this is how I feel, they start finding those words to really, define what they experienced, or to describe what they experienced.
Well, and we're really validating, their emotion. Yes, it's okay to feel that way. And here's what we can do different, or that's fine to feel that way,
I do want to know, because I think this is something that we find often with kids who are, have experienced hard things, or they're dysregulated, or they're going through a lot, that transitions can be really hard for them, really tough. It could be a trigger, like going from, okay, snack is done, you need to clean up. That could be a complete fiasco. And so it's really preparing ourselves for because here's the deal. I think a lot of the time when we talk about power and control, that we do that with children, like we exert power and control over children. And so, we really want to make sure that kids have their autonomy. And with younger kids, this is what works, is that you give them two choices to choose from that work for you. So if you find that there's a huge transition time that's not working, you can say, do you want to put your cup away or do you want me to put your cup away? And it kind of gives them that feeling of, oh, I have that choice, but yet you're still, getting that snack is over without a fight, and I mean, we say it works sometimes it doesn't, but it's that consistency, but it's also making sure that kids feel not threatened to do it, that it's like, you're not so rigid with all of these routines, that there's some flexibility. And there's also creative ways that you do it where it's not like snack is over, it's time to clean up, because then that kind of creates that dynamic. It's that freeze, fight, flee mode. And then you have a lot more issues than anything. So predictability it's key and it's important, but sometimes it's really hard to get there. And so I just want to know, like, it's really figuring out ways to help, make that transition easier, but really also supporting children and their autonomy.
We only have a few, or we're actually at time right now. But there is the one more comment. The tribal police annual reports show a high rate of drinking, fighting in homes, and police having to go to these homes more than once. And here again is children witnessing words, actions, and pain. I actually shared in the first session, Cecilia, I was one of those women who had the police come numerous times, and it never changed. For me, it was like a tribal hierarchy or the tribal council. He had more power than I did. And a lot of the times I wouldn't go because I also thought of the consequences. If I did really turn him in, would I lose my children? Would I get beat up worse? And so it took me 7 years to leave. And so I think it's pretty common for this to happen. And I actually I fled to an urban area just to get out. That's what I had to do.
I think this is an important note. I know we're ending on time, but I think if emphasizing anything, it's really that we really do have to include our kiddos into our response as a program. That often, and really to help children and youth is really to help their parents, help their non-offending parent, but also to include them in that. So, it's not just offering, rental assistance, it's providing what Hope had mentioned, opportunities for children and the parent to connect in a way that maybe they wouldn't have that opportunity. Pumpkin carving, looking for eggs, those things, that is part of that program. And, just going with that, the report, that's important, that we are really responding with our children in mind. And parents, we don't want them to be afraid to seek resources. And with that, if there's no questions, we will end.
These are also recorded, so they will be posted after the whole training's over. And I want to thank you guys each for coming and joining us today.